Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Today we are reading The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. If you like what you hear, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, on with our story time. Off there to the right, somewhere, is a large island, said Whitney. It's rather a mystery. What island is it? Rainsford asked. The old charts call it Ship Trap Island, Whitney replied. A suggestive name, isn't it? Sailors have a curious dread of the place. I don't know why. Some superstition. Can't see it, remarked Rainsford, trying to peer through the dank, tropical night that was palpable as it pressed its thick, warm blackness in upon the yacht. You have good eyes, said Whitney with a laugh, and I have seen you pick off a moose moving in the brown fall bush at 400 yards. But even you can't see 4 miles or so through a moonless Caribbean night. Nor 4 yards, admitted Rainsford. It's like a moist black velvet. It will be light enough in Rio, promised Whitney. We should make it in a few days. Hope the Jaguar guns have come from Purdy's. We should have some good hunting up the Amazon. Good sport hunting, finally. The best sport in the world, agreed Rainsford. For the hunter, amended Whitney, not for the Jaguar. Don't talk rot now, Whitney, said Rainsford. You're a big game hunter, not a philosopher. Who cares how a Jaguar feels? Well, perhaps the Jaguar does, observed Whitney. Bah, they've no understanding. Even so, I rather think they understand one thing, fear. The fear of pain and the fear of death. Nonsense, laughed Rainsford. This hot weather is making you soft, Whitney. Be a realist. The world is made up of 2 classes, the hunters and the huntees. Luckily, you and I are hunters. Do you think we've passed the island yet? I can't tell in the dark, sir. I hope so. Why? Asked Rainsford. The place has a reputation. A bad one. Cannibals, suggested Rainsford. Hardly. Even cannibals wouldn't live in such a god-forsaken place. But it's gotten into sailor lore somehow. Didn't you notice the crew's nerves seemed a bit jumpy today? They were a bit strange, now you mention it. Even Captain Nielsen. Yes, even that tough-minded old Swede would go up to the devil himself and ask for a light. Those fishy blue eyes held a look I had never seen there before. All I could get out of him was, this place has an evil name among seafaring men. And then he said to me very gravely, don't you feel anything? As if the air about us was actually poisonous. Now you mustn't laugh when I tell you this. I did feel something like a sudden chill. But there was no breeze. The sea was as flat as a plate glass window. We were drawing near the island then. What I felt was a great mental chill, a sort of sudden dread. That's pure imagination, said Rainsford. One superstitious sailor can take the whole ship's company with his fear. Maybe. But sometimes I think sailors have an extra sense that tells them when they are in danger. Sometimes I think evil is a tangible thing, with wavelengths, just as sound and light have. An evil place can, so to speak, broadcast vibrations of evil. I'm glad we're finally out of this zone. I think I'll turn in now, Rainsford. Well, I'm not sleepy, said Rainsford. I'm going to smoke another pipe up on the afterdeck. Good night then, Rainsford. See you at breakfast. Good night. There was no sound in the night as Rainsford sat there, but the muffled throb of the engine that drove the yacht swiftly through the darkness, and the swish and ripple and wash of the propeller. Rainsford, reclining in a steamer chair, indolently puffed on his favorite briar. The sensuous drowsiness of the night was on him. It's so dark, he thought, that I could sleep without closing my eyes. The night would simply be my eyelids. An abrupt sound startled him. Off to the right he heard it, and his ears, experts in such matters, could not be mistaken. Again he heard the sound, and again. Somewhere off in the blackness, someone had fired a gun 3 times. Rainsford sprang up and moved quickly to the rail, mystified. He strained his eyes in the direction from which the reports had come, but it was like trying to see through a blanket. He leapt upon the rail and balanced himself there to get greater elevation. His pipe, striking a rope, was knocked from his mouth. He lunged for it. A short, hoarse cry came from his lips, as he realized he had reached too far and had lost his balance. The cry was pinched off short as the blood-warm waters of the Caribbean Sea dosed over his head. He struggled up to the surface and tried to cry out, but the wash from the speeding yacht slapped him in the face, and the salt water in his open mouth made him gag and strangle. Desperately, he struck out with strong strokes after the receding lights of the yacht, but he stopped before he had swum 50 feet. A certain cool-headedness had come to him. It was not the first time he had been in a tight place. There was a chance that his cries could be heard by someone aboard the yacht, but that chance was slender, and grew more slender as the yacht raced on. He wrestled himself out of his clothes and shouted with all of his power. The lights of the yacht became faint and ever-vanishing fireflies. Then they were blotted out entirely by the night. Rainsford remembered the shots. They had come from the right, and doggedly he swam in that direction, swimming with slow, deliberate strokes, conserving his strength. For a seemingly endless time, he fought the sea. He began to count his strokes. He could do possibly 100 more, and then Rainsford heard another sound. It came out of the darkness, a high screaming sound, the sound of an animal in the extremity of anguish and terror. He did not recognize the animal that made the sound, and he did not try to. With fresh vitality he swam. He heard it again, and then it was cut short by another noise, crisp, staccato. It was a pistol shot, he realized. 10 minutes of determined effort brought another sound to his ears, the most welcome sound he had ever heard, the muttering and growling of the sea breaking on a rocky shore. He was almost upon the rocks before he saw them. On a night less calm, he would have been shattered against them. With his remaining strength, he dragged himself from the swirling waters. Jagged crags appeared, jutting up into the opaqueness. He forced himself upward, hand over hand. Gasping, his hands raw, he reached a flat place at the top. Dense jungle came down to the very edge of the cliffs. What perils the tangle of trees and underbrush might hold for him did not concern Rainsford just then. All he knew was that he was safe from his enemy, the sea, and that utter weariness was upon him. He flung himself down at the jungle edge and tumbled headlong into the deepest sleep of his life. When he opened his eyes, he knew from the position of the sun that it was late in the afternoon. Sleep had given him new vigor. A sharp hunger was picking at him. He looked about himself almost cheerfully. Where there are pistol shots, there are men. Where there are men, there is food, he thought. But what kind of men, he wondered, lived in so forbidding a place? An unbroken front of snarled and ragged jungle fringed the shore. He saw no sign of a trail through the closely knit web of weeds and trees. It was easier to go along the shore, and Rainsford floundered along by the water. Not far from where he landed, he stopped. Some wounded thing, by the evidence, A large animal had thrashed about in the underbrush. The jungle weeds were crushed down, and the moss was lacerated. One patch of weeds was stained crimson. A small, glittering object not far away caught Rainsford's eye, and he picked it up. He saw that it was an empty cartridge. A 22, he remarked. That's odd. Must have been a fairly large animal, too. The hunter had his nerve with him to tackle it with a light gun. It's clear that the brute put up a fight. I suppose the first 3 shots I heard were when the hunter flushed his quarry. He might have wounded it then. The last shot was when he trailed it here and finished it. He examined the ground closely and found what he hoped to find, the print of hunting boots. They pointed along the cliff in the direction he had been going. Eagerly he hurried along, now slipping on a rotten log or a loose stone, but making headway. Night was beginning to settle down on the island. Bleak darkness was blacking out the sea and jungle when Rainsford sighted the lights. He came upon them as he turned a crook in the coastline, and his first thought was that he had come upon a village, for there were many lights. But as he forged along, he saw, to his great astonishment, that all of the lights were in one enormous building, a lofty structure with pointed towers, plunging towards the gloom. His eyes made out the shadowy outlines of the palatial chateau. It was set on a high cliff, and on 3 sides of it, cliffs dived down toward the sea licked greedily lips in the shadows. Mirage, thought Rainsford. But it was no mirage he found when he opened the tall, spiked iron gate. The stone steps were real enough. The massive door with a leering gargoyle for a knocker was real enough. Yet above it all hung an air of unreality. He lifted the knocker, and it creaked up stiffly, as if it had never before been used. He let it fall, and it startled him with its booming loudness. He thought he heard steps within, but the door remained closed. Again Rainsford lifted the heavy knocker and let it fall. The door opened then, opened as suddenly as if it were on a spring, and Rainsford stood blinking in the river of glaring gold light that poured out. The first thing Rainsford's eyes discerned was the largest man Rainsford had ever seen, a gigantic creature, solidly made and black-bearded to the waist. In his hand, the man held a long-barreled revolver, and he was pointing it straight at Rainsford's heart. Out of the snarl of beard, 2 small eyes regarded Rainsford. "Don't be alarmed," said Rainsford with a smile, which he hoped was disarming. "I'm no robber. I fell off a yacht. My name is Sanger Rainsford, and I am from New York City." The menacing look in the eyes did not change, the revolver pointing as rigidly as if it were a giant in a statue. He gave no sign that he understood Rainsford's words, or that he even heard them. He was dressed in uniform, a black uniform trimmed with gray astrakhan. "I am Sanger of New York City," Rainsford began again. "I fell off a yacht. I am hungry. I am not dangerous." The man's only answer was to raise with his thumb the hammer of his revolver. Then Rainsford saw the man's free hand go to his forehead in a military salute, and he saw him click his heels together and stand at attention. Another man was coming down the broad marble steps, an erect, slender man in evening clothes. He advanced to Rainsford and held out his hand. In a cultivated voice, marked by a slight accent that gave it added precision and deliberateness, he said, "It is a very great pleasure and honor to welcome Mr. Sanger Rainsford, the celebrated hunter, to my home." Automatically, Rainsford shook the man's hand. "I've read your book about hunting snow leopards in Tibet, you see," explained the man. "I am Generall Zaroff." Rainsford's first impression was that the man was singularly handsome. His second was that there was an original, almost bizarre quality about the general's face. He was a tall man, past middle age, for his hair was a vivid white, but his thick eyebrows and pointed military mustache were as black as the night from which Rainsford had come. His eyes, too, were black and very bright. He had high cheekbones, a sharp-cut nose, a spare, dark face, the face of a man used to giving orders, the face of an aristocrat. Turning to the giant in uniform, the general made a sign. The giant put away his pistol, saluted, and withdrew. "Ivan is an incredibly strong fellow," remarked the general, "but he has had the misfortune of being deaf and dumb. A simple fellow, but I'm afraid, like all of his race, he's a bit too savage for my liking. Is he Russian?" "He is Cossack," said the general, and his smile showed red lips and pointed teeth. "As am I." "Come," he said, "we shouldn't be chatting here. We can talk later. Now you want clothes, food, rest. You shall have them. This is a more restful spot." Ivan had reappeared, and the general spoke to him with lips that moved, but gave forth no sound. "Follow Ivan, if you please, Mr. Rainsford," said the general. "I was about to have my dinner when you came, but I'll wait for you. You'll find that my clothes will fit you, I think." It was to a huge, beam-ceilinged bedroom with a canopied bed high enough for 6 men that Rainsford followed the silent giant. Ivan laid out an evening suit, and Rainsford, as he put it on, noticed that it came from a London tailor, ordinarily cut and sewed for none below the rank of duke. The dining room to which Ivan conducted him was in many ways remarkable. There was a medieval magnificence about it. It suggested a baronial hall of feudal times, with its oaken panels, its high ceiling, its vast refectory tables, where 20 men could sit down to eat. All about the hall were mounted heads of many animals: lions, tigers, elephants, moose, bear, larger or more perfect specimens Rainsford had never seen. At the great table, the general was sitting alone. "You'll have a cocktail, Mr. Rainsford," he suggested. The cocktail was surpassingly good, and Rainsford noted that the table appointments were of the finest: the linen, the crystal, the silver, the china. They were eating borscht, the rich red soup with whipped cream so dear to Russian palates. Half apologetically, General Zaroff said, "We do our best to preserve the amenities of civilization here. Please forgive any lapses. We are well off the beaten track, you know. Do you think the champagne has suffered from its long ocean trip?" "Not in the least," declared Rainsford. He was finding the general a more thoughtful and affable host, a true cosmopolite. But there was one small trait of the general's that made Rainsford uncomfortable. Whenever he looked up from his plate, he found the general studying him, praising him narrowly. "Perhaps," said General Zaroff, "you were surprised that I recognized your name. You see, I read all the books on hunting published in English, French, and Russian. I have but one passion in my life, Mr. Rainsford, and that is the hunt." "You have some wonderful heads here," said Rainsford, as he ate a particularly well-cooked filet mignon. "That Cape buffalo is the largest I have ever seen." "Oh, that fellow. Yes, he was a monster." "Did it charge you?" "Hurled me against a tree," said the general. "Fractured my skull. But I got the brute." "I've always thought," said Rainsford, "that the Cape buffalo is the most dangerous of all big game." For a moment the general did not reply. He was smiling his curious red-lipped smile. Then he said slowly, "No, you are wrong, sir. The Cape buffalo is not the most dangerous big game." He sipped his wine. "Here in my preserve on this island," he started with the same slow tone, "I hunt more dangerous game. Rainsford expressed his surprise. There is big game on this island. The general nodded. The biggest. Really? Oh, it isn't here naturally, of course. I have to stock the island. Well, what have you imported, General? Rainsford asked. Tigers? The general smiled. No, he said. Hunting tigers ceased to interest me some years ago. I exhausted their possibilities, you see. No thrill left in tigers. No real danger. I live for danger, Mr. Rainsford. The general was quiet for a moment. And then he took from his pocket a gold cigarette case. He offered Rainsford a long black cigarette with a silver tip. It was perfumed and gave off a smell like incense. We will have some capital hunting, you and I, said the general. I shall be most glad to have your society. But what game? Began Rainsford. I'll tell you, said the general, interrupting. You will be amused, I know. I think I may say, in all modesty, that I have done a rare thing. I have invented a new sensation. May I pour you another glass of port? Yes, thank you, General. The general filled both glasses and said, God makes some men poets. Some he makes kings. Some beggars. He made me into a hunter. My hand was made for the trigger, my father said. He was a very rich man, with 250,000 acres in the Crimea, and he was an ardent sportsman. When I was only 5 years old, he gave me a little gun, specially made for me in Moscow, to shoot sparrows with. When I shot some of his prize turkeys with it, he did not punish me. He complimented me on my marksmanship. I killed my first bear in the Caucasus when I was 10. My whole life has been one prolonged hunt. I went into the army. It was expected of noblemen's sons, and for a time I commanded a division of Cossack cavalry. But my real interest was always the hunt. I have hunted every kind of game in every land. It would be impossible for me to tell you how many animals I have killed. The general paused for a long moment and puffed at his cigarette. After the debacle in Russia, I left the country, for it was more imprudent for an officer of the Tsar to stay there. Many noble Russians lost everything. I, luckily, had invested heavily in American securities, so I shall never have to open a tea room in Monte Carlo or drive a taxi in Paris. Naturally, I continued to hunt grizzlies in your Rockies, crocodiles in the Ganges, rhinoceros in East Africa. It was in Africa that the Cape buffalo hit me and laid me up for 6 months. As soon as I recovered, I started for the Amazon to hunt jaguars, for I had heard they were unusually cunning. But they weren't. The Cossack sighed. They were no match at all for the hunter with his wits about him and a high-powered rifle. I was bitterly disappointed. I was lying in my tent with a splitting headache one night when a terrible thought pushed its way into my mind. Hunting was beginning to bore me, and hunting, remember, had been my life. I have heard that in America, businessmen often go to pieces when they have given up the business that has been their life. I guess that's so, said Rainsford. The general smiled at this. I had no wish to go to pieces, he said. I must do something. Now, my mind is analytical, Mr. Rainsford. Doubtless, that is why I enjoy the problems of the chase. No doubt, General Zaroff. So, continued the general, I asked myself why the hunt no longer fascinated me. You are much younger than I am, Mr. Rainsford, and have not hunted as much. But perhaps you can guess the answer. What is it? I don't know. Simply this. Hunting had ceased, to be what you call a sporting proposition. It became too easy. I always got my quarry. Always. There is no greater bore than perfection. The general lit a fresh cigarette. No animal had a chance with me anymore. That is no boast. It is a mathematical certainty. The animal had nothing but his legs and his instinct. But instinct is no match for reason. When I thought of this, it was a tragic moment for me. Rainsford felt absorbed in the conversation and leaned across the table. It came to me as an inspiration what I must do, the general went on. And what was that, sir? The general smiled the quiet smile of one who has faced an obstacle and surmounted it with success. I had to invent a new animal to hunt, he said. A new animal? You're joking. Not at all, said the general. I never joke about hunting. I needed a new animal, so I found one. So I bought this island and built this house, and here is where I do my hunting. The island is perfect for my purposes. There are jungles with a maze of traits in them, hills, swamps. But what animal, General Zaroff? Well, said the general, it supplies me with the most exciting hunting in the world. No other hunting compares with it for an instant. Every day I hunt, and I never grow bored now, for I have a quarry with which I can match my wits. Rainsford's bewilderment showed in his face. I wanted the ideal animal to hunt, explained the general. So I said, what are the attributes of an ideal quarry? And the answer was, of course, it must have courage, cunning, and above all, it must be able to reason. But no animal can reason, objected Rainsford. My dear fellow, said the general, there is one that can. But you can't mean, gasped Rainsford. And why not? I can't believe you are serious, General Zaroff. This is a grisly joke. Why should I not be serious? I am speaking of hunting. Hunting? Great guns, General Zaroff. What you speak of is murder. The general laughed with an entire good nature. He regarded Rainsford quizzically. I refuse to believe that so modern and civilized a young man as you seem to be harbors romantic ideas about the value of human life. Surely your experiences in war do not make me condone cold-blooded murder, finished Rainsford stiffly. Laughter shook the general. How extraordinarily droll you are, he said. One does not now expect to find a young man of the educated class, even in America, with such a naive, and if I may say so, mid-Victorian point of view. It's like finding a snuff box in a limousine. Ah, well, doubtless you had Puritan ancestors. So many Americans appear to have had. I'll wager you'll forget your notions when you go hunting with me. You have a genuine new thrill in store for you, Mr. Rainsford. Thank you, sir. I am a hunter, though, not a murderer. Dear me, said the general, quite unruffled. Again, that unpleasant word. But I think I can show you that your scruples are quite ill-founded. How? Life is for the strong, to be lived by the strong, and if needs be, taken by the strong. The weak of the world were put here to give the strong pleasure. I am strong. Why should I not use my gift? If I wish to hunt, why should I not? I hunt the scum of the earth, sailors from tramp ships, Lazars, blacks, Chinese, whites. A thoroughbred horse or hound is worth more than a score of them. But they are men, said Rainsford. Precisely, said the general, and that is why I use them. It gives me pleasure. They can reason after a fashion, so they are dangerous. But where do you get them? The general's left eyelid fluttered down in a wink. This island is called Shiptrap, he answered. Sometimes an angry god of the high seas sends them to me. Sometimes, when Providence is not so kind, I help Providence a bit. Come to the window with me. Rainsford went to the window and looked out upon the sea. Watch, exclaimed the general. Out there. He pointed into the night. Rainsford saw only blackness. But then, as the general pressed a button, proud to see Rainsford saw the flash of lights. The general chuckled. They indicate a channel, he said, where there's none. Razor-sharp rocks. Crouch like sea monsters with wide-open jaws. They can crush a ship as easily as I can crush this nut. He dropped a walnut on the hardwood floor and brought his heel grinding down on top of it. Oh yes, he said casually, as if in answer to a question. I have electricity. We try to be civilized here. Civilized, but you're shooting down men. A trace of anger was in the general's eyes, but it was there for but a second, and he said, in a most pleasant manner, Dear me, what a righteous young man you are. I assure you, I do not do the thing you suggest. That would be barbarous. I treat these visitors with every consideration. They get plenty of food and exercise. They get into splendid physical condition. You shall see for yourself tomorrow. What do you mean by that? Asked Rainsford. We'll visit my training school, smiled the general. It's in the cellar. I have about a dozen pupils down there now. They're from the Spanish bark, San Lucar. Had the bad luck to go out on the rocks there. A very inferior lot, I regret to say. Poor specimens, and more accustomed to the deck than to the jungle. He raised his hand, and Ivan, who served as waiter, brought thick Turkish coffee. Rainsford, with an effort, held his tongue in check. It's a game, you see, pursued the general blandly. I suggest to one of them that we go hunting. I give him a supply of food and an excellent hunting knife. I give him 3 hours' start. I am to follow, armed only with a pistol of the smallest caliber and range. If my quarry eludes me for 3 whole days, he wins the game. If I find him, the general smiled, he loses. But suppose he refuses to be hunted? Oh, said the general, I give him his options, of course. He need not play the game if he doesn't wish to. If he does not wish to hunt, I turn him over to Ivan. Ivan once had the honor of serving as official counter to the great white Tsar, and he has his own ideas of sport. Invariably, Mr. Rainsford, invariably they choose to hunt, and if they win, the smile on the general's face widened. To date, I have not lost. Then he added hastily, I don't wish you to think me a braggart, Mr. Rainsford. Many of them afford only the most elementary sort of problem. Occasionally I struck a Tartar. One almost did win. I eventually had to use the dogs. The dogs? This way, please. I'll show you. The general steered Rainsford to another window. The lights from the windows sent a flickering illumination that made grotesque patterns on the courtyard below. And Rainsford could see moving out there a dozen or so huge black shapes. As they turned toward him, their eyes glittered greenly. A rather good lot, I think, observed the general. They're let out at 7 every night. If anyone should try to get into my house, we're out of it. Something extremely regrettable would occur to him. He hummed a bit of song. And now, said the general, I want to show you my collection of heads. Will you join me in the library? I hope, said Rainsford, that you will excuse me tonight, General Zaroff. I'm not really feeling very well. Oh, indeed, the General inquired solicitously. Well, I suppose that's only natural after your long swim. You need a good, restful night's sleep. Tomorrow you'll feel like a new man, I'll wager. Then we'll hunt. I've one rather promising prospect. Rainsford was hurrying from the room, no longer listening. Sorry you can't go with me tonight, called out the General loudly. I expect rather fair sport. A big, strong man. He looks resourceful. Well, good night, Mr. Rainsford. I hope you have a good night's rest. Bed was good, and the pajamas of the softest silk, and he was tired in every fiber of his being. But nevertheless, Rainsford could not quiet his brain with the opiate of sleep. He lay, eyes wide open. Once he thought he heard stealthy steps in the corridor outside his room. He sought to throw open the door, but it would not open. He went to the window and looked out. His room was high up in one of the towers. The lights of the chateau were out now, and it was dark and silent. But there was a fragment of a sallow moon, and by its wane of light he could see, dimly, the courtyard. There, weaving in and out in the pattern of shadow, were black, noiseless forms. The hounds heard him at the window and looked up expectantly with their green eyes. Rainsford went back to the bed and lay down. By many methods he tried to put himself to sleep. He had achieved a doze when, just as morning began to come, he heard, far off in the jungle, the faint report of a pistol. General Zaroff did not appear until lunch. He was dressed faultlessly in the tweeds of a country squire. He was kindly about the state of Rainsford's health. As for me, sighed the General, I do not feel so well. I am worried, Mr. Rainsford. Last night, I detected traces of my old complaint. To Rainsford's questioning glance, the General said, ennui, boredom. Then, taking a second helping of crepe Suzette, the General explained. The hunting was not good last night. The fellow lost his head. He made a straight trail that offered no problems at all. That's the trouble with these sailors. They have dull brains to begin with, and they do not know how to get about in the woods. They do excessively stupid and obvious things. It's most annoying. Will you have another glass of Chablis, Mr. Rainsford? General, said Rainsford firmly, I wish to leave this island at once. The General raised his thickets of eyebrows and seemed to hurt. But my dear fellow, the General protested, you've only just come here. You've had no hunting yet. I wish to go today, said Rainsford. He saw the dead black eyes of the General on him, studying him. General Zaroff's face suddenly brightened. He filled Rainsford's glass with a venerable Chablis from a dusty bottle. Tonight, said the General, we will hunt, you and I. Rainsford shook his head. No, General, he said, I will not hunt. The General shrugged his shoulders and delicately ate a hothouse grape. As you wish, my friend, he said. The choice rests entirely with you. But may I not venture to suggest that you will find my idea of sport more diverting than Ivan's? He nodded toward the corner where the giant stood, scowling, his thick arms crossed on his hogshead of chest. You don't mean, cried Rainsford. My dear fellow, said the General, have I not told you I always mean what I say about hunting? This is really an inspiration. I drink to a foeman worthy of my steel, and lass, The general raised his glass. The Rainsford sat staring at him in horror. "You'll find this game worth playing," the general said. He was enthusiastic. "Your brain against mine. Your woodcraft against mine. Your strength and stamina against mine. Outdoor chess. And the stake is not without value, yes." "And if I win," began Rainsford huskily, "I'll cheerfully acknowledge myself defeat if I do not find you by midnight of the third day," said General Zaroff. "My sloop will place you on the mainland near a town." The general read what Rainsford was thinking. "Oh, you can trust me," said the general. "I will give you my word as a gentleman and a sportsman. Of course, you in turn must agree to say nothing of your visit here." "I'll agree to nothing of the kind," said Rainsford. "Oh," said the general, "in that case, but why discuss that now? 3 days hence we can discuss it over the finest bottle I have in my cellar, unless—" the general sipped his wine. Then a businesslike air animated him. "Ivan will supply you with hunting clothes, food, and a knife. I suggest you wear moccasins, as they leave less of a trail. I suggest, too, that you avoid the big swamp in the southeast corner of the island. We call it Death Swamp. There's quicksand there. One foolish fellow tried it. The deplorable part was that Lazarus followed him. You can imagine my feelings, Mr. Rainsford. I loved Lazarus. He was the finest hound in my pack. Well, I must beg you to excuse me now. I always take a siesta after lunch. You'll hardly have time for a nap, I fear. You'll want to start, no doubt. I shall not follow until dusk. Hunting at night is so much more exciting than by day, don't you think? Goodbye, Mr. Rainsford. Goodbye." General Zaroff, with a deep, courtly bow, strolled from the room. From another door came Ivan. Under one arm he carried khaki hunting clothes, a haversack of food, a leather sheath containing a long-bladed hunting knife. His right hand rested on a cocked revolver, thrust in the crimson sash about his waist. Rainsford had fought his way through the bush for 2 hours. "I must keep my nerve," he said. "I must keep my nerve." He had not been entirely clear-headed when the chateau gate snapped shut behind him. His whole idea at first was to put distance between himself and General Zaroff, and to this end he had plunged along, spurred on by the sharp rowers of something very like panic. Now he had got a grip on himself, had stopped, and was taking stock of himself and the situation. He saw that straight flight was futile. Inevitably, it would bring him face to face with the sea. He was in a pitcher with a frame of water, and his operations, clearly, must take place within that frame. "I'll give him a trail to follow," muttered Rainsford, and he struck off from the rude path he had been following into the trackless wilderness. He executed a series of intricate loops. He doubled on his trail again and again, recalling all of the lore of the fox hunt and all of the dodges of the fox. Night found him leg-weary, with hands and face lashed by the branches on a thickly wooded ridge. He knew it would be insane to blunder on through the dark, even if he had the strength. His need for rest was imperative, and he thought, "I have played the fox. Now I must play the cat of the fable." A big tree with a thick trunk and outspread branches was nearby, and taking care not to leave the slightest mark, he climbed up into the crotch, and stretching out on one of the broad limbs, after a fashion, rested. Rest brought him new confidence, and almost a feeling of security. Even so zealous a hunter as General Zaroff could not trace him there, he told himself. Only the devil himself could follow that complicated trail through the jungle after dark. But perhaps the general was a devil. An apprehensive night crawled slowly by like a wounded snake, and sleep did not visit Rainsford, although the silence of a dead world was on the jungle. Tomorrow morning, when a dingy gray was vanishing the sky, the cry of some startled bird focused Rainsford's attention in that direction. Something was coming through the bush, coming slowly, carefully, coming by the same winding trail Rainsford had come. He flattened himself down on the limb, and through a screen of leaves, almost as thick as tapestry, he watched. That which was approaching was a man. It was Generall Zaroff. He made his way along with his eyes fixed in utmost concentration on the ground before him. He paused, almost beneath the tree, dropped to his knees, and studied the ground. Rainsford felt the impulse to hurl himself down like a panther, but he saw that the general's right hand held something metallic, his small automatic pistol. The hunter shook his head several times as if he were puzzled. Then he straightened up and took from his case one of his black cigarettes. Its pungent incense, like smoke, floated up to Rainsford's nostrils. Rainsford held his breath. The general's eyes had left the ground and were traveling inch by inch up the tree. Rainsford froze, every muscle tensed for a spring. But the sharp eyes of the hunter stopped before they reached the limb where Rainsford lay. A smile spread over his face. Very deliberately, he blew smoke into the air in the shape of a ring. Then he turned his back on the tree and walked carelessly away, back along the trail he had come. The swish of the underbrush against his hunting boots grew fainter and fainter. The pent-up air burst hotly from Rainsford's lungs. His first thought made him feel sick and numb. The general could follow a trail through the woods at night. He could follow an extremely difficult trail. He must have uncanny powers. Only by the merest chance had the Cossack failed to see his quarry. Rainsford's second thought was even more terrible. It sent a shudder of cold horror through his whole being. Why had the general smiled? Why had he turned back? Rainsford did not want to believe what his reason told him was true, but the truth was as evident as the sun that had by now pushed through the morning mists. The general was playing with him. The general was saving him for another day's sport. The general was the cat. Rainsford was the mouse. Then it was that Rainsford felt the full meaning of terror. "I will not lose my nerve," he said. "I will not." He slid down from the tree and struck off again into the woods. His face was set, and he forced the machinery out of his mind to function. 300 yards from his hiding spot he stopped were huge dead trees, leaned precariously on a smaller living one. Throwing off his sack of food, Rainsford took his knife from its sheath and began to work with all of his energy. The job was finished at last, and he threw himself down behind a fallen log 100 feet away. He did not wait long. The cat was coming again to play with the mouse. Following the trail with the sureness of a bloodhound came Generall Zaroff. Nothing escaped those searching black eyes. No crushed blade of grass, no bent twig, no mark, no matter how faint, in the moss. So intent was the general on his stalking that he was upon the thing Rainsford had made before he saw it. His foot touched the protruding bough that was the trigger. Even as he touched it, the general sensed his danger and leapt back with the agility of an ape. But he was not quite quick enough. The dead tree, delicately adjusted to rest on the cut living one, crashed down and struck the general a glancing blow on the shoulder as it fell. But for his alertness, he would have been smashed beneath it. He staggered, but he did not fall, nor did he drop his revolver. He stood there, rubbing his injured shoulder, and Rainsford, with fear again gripping his heart, heard the General's mocking laugh ring through the jungle. "Rainsford," called the General, "you are within sound of my voice, as I suppose you are. Let me congratulate you. Not many men know how to make a Malay man-catcher. Lucky for me, I too have hunted in Malacca. You are proving interesting, Mr. Rainsford. I'm going now to have my wound dressed. It's only a slight one, but I shall be back. You know I will be back." When the General, nursing his bruised shoulder, had gone, Rainsford took up his flight again. It was flight now, a desperate, hopeless flight that carried him on for some hours. Dusk came, then darkness, and still he pressed on. The ground grew softer under his moccasins. The vegetation grew ranker, denser. Insects bit him savagely. Then, as he stepped forward, his foot sank into the ooze. He tried to wrench it back, but the muck sucked viciously at his foot, as if it were a giant leech. With a violent effort, he tore his feet loose. He knew where he was now. Death Swamp and its quicksand. His hands were tight closed, as if his nerve were something tangible that someone in the darkness was trying to tear from his grip. The softness of the earth had given him an idea. He stepped back from the quicksand a dozen or so feet, and like some huge prehistoric beaver, he began to dig. Rainsfield had dug himself in France when a second's delay meant death. That had been a placid pastime compared to this digging now. The pit grew deeper. When it was above his shoulders, he climbed out. He cut stakes from hard saplings and sharpened them to a fine point. These stakes he planted at the bottom of the pit with the points sticking up. With flying fingers, he wove a rough carpet of weeds and branches, and with it he covered the mouth of the pit. Then, wet with sweat and aching with tiredness, he crouched behind the stump of a lightning-charred tree. He knew his pursuer was coming. He heard the padding sound of feet on the soft earth, and the night breeze brought him the perfume of the General's cigarette. It seemed to Rainsford that the General was coming with unusual swiftness. He was not feeling his way along, foot by foot. Rainsford, crouching there, could not see the General, nor could he see the pit. He lived a year in 1 minute. Then he felt an impulse to cry aloud with joy, for he heard the sharp crackle of the breaking branches as the cover of the pit gave way. He heard the sharp scream of pain as the pointed stakes found their mark. He leaped up from his place of concealment, but then he cowered back. 3 feet from the pit, a man was standing, with an electric torch in his hand. "You've done well, Rainsford," said the voice of the General. "Your Burmese tiger pit has claimed one of my best dogs. Again, you score. I think, Mr. Rainsford, we'll see what you can do against my whole pack. I'm going home to rest now. Thank you for a most amusing evening." At daybreak, Rainsford, lying near the swamp, was awakened by a sound that made him know that he had new things to learn about fear. It was a distant sound, faint and wavering, but he knew it. It was the baying of a pack of hounds. Rainsford knew he could do one of 2 things. He could stay where he was and wait. That was suicide. He could flee. That was postponing the inevitable. For a moment he stood there, thinking. An idea that held a wild chance came to him, and tightening his belt, he headed away from the swamp. The baying of the hounds drew nearer, and still nearer, nearer, ever nearer. On a ridge, Rainsford climbed a tree. Down a watercourse, not a quarter of a mile away, he could see the bush moving. Straining his eyes, he saw the lean figure of Generall Zaroff. Just ahead of him, Rainsford made out another figure, whose wide shoulders surged through the tall jungle weeds. It was the giant Ivan, and he seemed pulled forward by some unseen force. Rainsford knew that Ivan must be holding the pack on a leash. They would be upon him any minute now. His mind worked frantically. He thought of a native trick he had learned in Uganda. He slid down the tree. He got hold of a springy young sapling, and to it he fastened his hunting knife, with the blade pointing down the trail. With a bit of wild grapevine, he tied back the sapling. Then he ran for his life. The hounds raised their voices as they hit the fresh scent. Rainsford knew now how any animal at bay must feel. He had to stop to get his breath. The baying of the hounds stopped abruptly, and Rainsford's heart stopped too. They must have reached the knife. He shimmied up a tree excitedly and looked back. His pursuers had stopped, but the hope that was in his brain when he climbed the tree died. For he saw in the shallow valley that Generall Zaroff was still on his feet, but Ivan was not. The knife, driven by the recoil of the springing tree, had not wholly failed. Rainsford had hardly tumbled to the ground when the back took up the cry again. Nerve, 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 he panted as he dashed along. The blue gap showed between the trees dead ahead. Ever nearer drew the hounds. Rainsford forced himself on towards that gap. He reached it. It was the shore of the sea. Across a cove, he could see the glooming gray stone of the chateau. 20 feet below him, the sea rumbled and hissed. Rainsford hesitated. He heard the hounds, and then he leapt far out into the sea. When the general and his pack reached the place by the sea, the general stopped. For some minutes, he stood regarding the blue-green expanse of water. He shrugged his shoulders. Then he sat down, took a drink of brandy from a silver flask, lit a cigarette, and hummed a bit of tune from Madame Butterfly. Generall Zaroff had an exceedingly good dinner in his great panelled dining hall that evening. With it he had a bottle of Paul Roger and half a bottle of Chambertin. Two slight annoyances kept him from perfect enjoyment. One was the thought that it would be difficult to replace Ivan. The other was that his quarry had escaped him, of course. The American hadn't played the game, so thought the general, as he tasted his after-dinner liqueur. In his library he read, to soothe himself, from the works of Marcus Aurelius. At 10 he went to his bedroom. He was deliciously tired, he said to himself, as he locked himself in. There was a little moonlight, so before turning on his light, he went to the window and looked down at the courtyard. He could see the great hounds, and he called, "Better luck next time." Then he switched on his light. A man, who had been hiding in the curtains of the bed, was standing there. "Rainsford," screamed the general. "How in God's name did you get here?" "I swam," said Rainsford. "I found it quicker than walking through the jungle." The general sucked in his breath and smiled. "I congratulate you," he said. "You have won the game." Rainsford did not smile. "I am still a beast at bay," he said. His voice was low and hoarse. "Get ready, Generall Zaroff." The general made one of his deepest bows. "I see," he said. "Splendid. One of us is to furnish a repast, the hounds. The other will sleep in this very excellent bed. On guard, Rainsford." He had never slept in a better bed, Rainsford decided. And this, my darling, ends our story time for today. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams.